There is a saying among physicians who serve royal courts, passed down through generations of careful men who valued their own necks. The patient is never the only one in the room who is sick. Dr. Elias Wren had heard that saying 100 times before he ever set foot on the alien homeworld of Thren. He had never once believed it applied to him. He was, by every measure that mattered to the people who had sent him, an unremarkable man, 40 years old, graying at the temples, with the kind of steady hands that came from decades of quiet, unglamorous work. He had spent the better part of his career treating diplomats and merchants in the human enclaves, scattered across the outer colonies, men and women who wanted their ailments handled quickly and quietly, without fuss. He was not a famous physician. He was not a court physician. He had never treated anyone more important than a trade minister's gout. That was precisely why they chose him. The Threnai royal court did not trust human specialists who came with reputations, because reputations came with agendas, and agendas came with leverage. They wanted someone clean, someone with no political weight, no faction, no history that could be used against him. Elias Wren fit that requirement so perfectly that the summons arrived at his clinic with a wax seal he had never seen before, carried by a courier who would not meet his eyes. The king of Thren had lost his mind. That was the rumor moving through every embassy and trading post within 3 systems. Months of erratic behavior, sudden rages, silences that stretched for days, accusations against loyal advisors that made no sense, followed by fits of tearful apology that made even less. The council was fracturing. Neighboring worlds were watching the throne the way vultures watch a wounded animal, waiting to see if it would fall on its own. They needed a diagnosis. They needed, more specifically, a human diagnosis, because a human had no stake in Threnai politics, no favorite among the 9 noble houses, nothing to gain by lying. If a human physician certified the king insane, the council could act. If he certified the king sane, the whispers would have to stop. Elias did not want the job. He said as much to the courier quietly, in the doorway of his own clinic, with the evening light behind him and his tea going cold on the counter inside. He was not a psychiatrist. He barely understood Threnai physiology beyond what the standard medical charts described. He had a good practice, a modest home, and absolutely no desire to become the human who diagnosed an alien king and then spent the rest of his life as a political football. The courier told him without much warmth that refusal was not really among the options being offered. He was on a transport within 2 days. The palace of Thren rose out of the planet's violet dusk like something grown rather than built, spires curling upward in slow spirals, the architecture following the logic of some ancient organic ancestor rather than any human sense of proportion. Elias stood at the base of it with his single case of instruments and felt for the first time since accepting the summons genuinely and completely out of his depth. He was met by a woman named Sorel, the king's chief steward, tall even by Threnai standards, with the pale gray skin and dark, unreadable eyes common to her people. She did not smile. She did not offer pleasantries. She simply told him that he would be given one examination, that the council would be watching from an adjoining chamber, and that his findings would be read aloud the moment he delivered them. Elias asked carefully whether he might examine the king privately first, before anything was read aloud to anyone. Sorel's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes did. It was the first flicker of real attention she had given him. She told him that privacy was not typically afforded to matters of state. He told her, just as carefully, that a diagnosis rushed for an audience was worth exactly nothing, and that if the council wanted a human opinion, they would have to accept human methods. There was a long pause. Then she nodded, once, and led him deeper into the palace. The king's chambers occupied the highest tier of the central spire, a vast round room, ringed with windows that looked out over the capital in every direction. Elias had expected grandeur, and he found it, but he had not expected the smell. Beneath the incense and the polished stone, there was something faintly bitter in the air, something chemical that did not belong in a room meant for rest. King Vareth Osan IX was sitting by one of the windows when Elias entered, wrapped in dark robes despite the mild warmth of the chamber, his long fingers gripping the arms of his chair as though he expected the floor to give way beneath him at any moment. He was younger than Elias had expected. The rumors had painted a portrait of a broken old tyrant, and instead there was a man in his prime, hollow-eyed, trembling slightly, watching the door with the wary attention of someone who had learned not to trust the people who walked through it. Elias introduced himself quietly. He did not bow, because he had been told humans were not expected to, and because he suspected that treating the king like a fragile object would do more harm than good. The king studied him for a long moment before speaking. His voice was low, controlled, but there was an unmistakable strain running underneath it, like a wire pulled almost to its breaking point. He said that Elias was the 7th physician sent to examine him this year. Elias asked what the other 6 had concluded. The king's mouth twisted into something that was not quite a smile. He said that the first 3 had told him he was fine and had been quietly removed from their positions within a month. He said the next 2 had told him he was losing his mind and had been rewarded with estates in the southern provinces. He said the 6th had refused to give any opinion at all and had simply disappeared. Elias felt something cold settle in his stomach. He kept his expression neutral, the way he had trained himself to do over 20 years of delivering bad news to frightened patients. He asked the king to describe, in his own words, what had been happening to him. What followed was nearly an hour of careful, methodical conversation. Elias asked about sleep, about appetite, about the timing of the episodes, whether they came at particular times of day, whether they followed meals, celebrations, meetings, whether they had gotten worse or simply changed shape over the months. He asked about the rages, and the king described them with a kind of horrified detachment, as though describing a stranger wearing his own skin. He said he would feel a heat rising behind his eyes, a pressure building at the base of his skull, and then there would be gaps. Moments he could not account for, and afterward the reports of what he had said or done would come back to him second-hand, delivered by advisors too frightened to meet his gaze. He said the tremors were worse in the evenings. He said his hands sometimes would not hold the pen steady enough to sign his own decrees. He said he had begun to dread meal times, though he could not have explained why. Only that some instinct, deep and old within him, recoiled from the food set in front of him, even as his body craved it with an intensity that frightened him more than the rages did. Elias listened to all of this without interrupting, without reacting, the way he had learned to listen to frightened patients who needed, more than anything, to feel heard before they could be helped. Then he asked to examine him properly. The physical examination took another hour. Elias checked the king's eyes, his reflexes, the fine tremor in his hands, the color beneath his fingernails, the condition of his skin. He asked through Sorel for a full accounting of the king's meals over the past several months. Which meals had preceded which episodes, who prepared them, who tasted them, who served them. He asked for samples. He asked specifically and pointedly to speak with the royal taster. Sorel told him the royal taster, a young man named Bren Otho, had served the king faithfully for 11 years and was above suspicion. Elias told her that in his experience, the words above suspicion were usually spoken about the person most in need of suspecting. He did not smile when he said it. He did not need to. That night, Elias did not sleep. He sat in the small guest chamber he had been given, surrounded by notes scrawled in his own cramped handwriting. Cross-referencing the king's described symptoms against every Threnai medical text he had been permitted to access. The tremors, the rages that came in waves and then vanished, leaving gaps in memory. The dread around food paired with an unnatural craving for it. The worsening symptoms in the evening. The improvement, however slight, that seemed to occur whenever the king had gone a day or more without eating a full meal. Something Elias had noted almost in passing during their conversation and had almost let slip by unremarked. That detail sat wrong in his mind. It sat wrong the way a splinter sits wrong beneath the skin, small and easy to ignore and utterly impossible to forget, once noticed. A man who is simply losing his mind did not improve when he stopped eating. A man being poisoned did. Elias had seen something like this before, years ago, in a much smaller and much less consequential case. A merchant's wife, on one of the outer colonies, slowly and steadily descending into what everyone around her assumed was a hereditary madness, until Elias, then a much younger and much more junior physician, had noticed that her episodes worsened after every visit from a particular relative bearing gifts of expensive tea. It had taken him weeks to prove it. It had taken the merchant's wife almost dying to convince anyone to look. He was not going to let that happen here. He requested access to the palace's food stores the following morning, framing it carefully as a routine part of his examination. Cyril escorted him personally this time, watching him with an intensity that suggested she, too, had begun to suspect something was rotten beneath the surface of the palace's calm. The kitchens were vast, humming with the quiet efficiency of a machine that had run the same way for centuries. Elias moved through them slowly, asking questions that seemed almost aimless, sampling grains here, sniffing at spice jars there, behaving, he hoped, like a man simply gathering background information rather than a man closing in on something. He found what he was looking for in a small jar of dried root ground into a fine reddish powder, kept among a dozen other spices in the section of the kitchen reserved specifically for the king's personal meals. It was labeled, innocuously, as a flavoring agent common to the southern provinces, used to add a subtle bitterness to certain traditional dishes. Elias had never seen it before, but something about its color, its texture, the faint chemical tang beneath the earthy smell, reminded him uncomfortably of a substance described in one of the older Threnai medical texts he had read the night before, a substance used centuries ago, before it had been banned, as a method of slow and deniable execution. It built up gradually in the body. It attacked the nervous system in small cumulative doses. It caused tremors. It caused rage. It caused gaps in memory, followed by a desperate physical craving for more of the very substance causing the harm, because the body, once poisoned, began to depend on the poison simply to function without violent withdrawal. It did not kill quickly. It did not kill, obviously. It simply, patiently, over months, made a man look as though he were losing his mind, right up until the moment his own council decided he had lost it entirely and moved to remove him from the throne. Elias took a small sample, wrapped carefully in cloth, and said nothing to anyone in the kitchen about what he had found. He requested, through Cyril, a private audience with the king that evening, before any findings were presented to the council. Cyril started to object, citing protocol, citing the promise she had made that his conclusions would be read aloud immediately upon completion. Elias told her quietly, but with a firmness that surprised even him, that if she valued her king's life, she would grant him 1 hour alone with the man before a single word of this reached anyone else. Something in his tone must have convinced her. She granted the audience. The king received him again by the window, in the same dark robes, looking somehow smaller than he had the day before, as though the weight of his own uncertainty were physically pressing down on him. He asked, almost too tired to sound afraid, whether Elias had reached a conclusion. Elias sat down across from him without waiting to be invited to. A breach of protocol he suspected the king would forgive under the circumstances. He said that he had. He said that the king was, in his professional opinion, entirely sane. The king's face did something complicated, relief and disbelief and a kind of exhausted grief all crossing his features at once, because a diagnosis of sanity, after months of fearing otherwise, should have been the best news he had received in a year. And yet the way Elias had said it, carefully, with a weight behind the words, suggested there was more coming and worse. Elias told him gently but without softening the truth that someone in his household had been poisoning him, slowly, deliberately, with a substance designed specifically to mimic the symptoms of madness so that anyone observing him from the outside, any council member, any physician sent to examine him, would see exactly what they were meant to see. A king unraveling, a throne destabilizing, a reason to act before the man in that chair could cause any more damage to himself or his kingdom. He explained the tremors. He explained the rages, the gaps in memory, the dread and craving around food that were the poison's signature, working exactly as its ancient designers had intended. He explained that the improvement the king had noticed, however slight, whenever he skipped a meal, was not a coincidence, and not a symptom of illness. It was the first sign of the poison beginning, briefly, to leave his system before the next dose brought the symptoms roaring back. The king sat very still for a long moment. Then he asked, in a voice gone thin and quiet, "Who?" Elias told him he did not yet have proof of who had administered it, only proof that it had been administered, found in a jar of spice reserved specifically for the king's meals, a jar that would have passed through very few hands before reaching the kitchen and very few hands after leaving it. He told the king there was one person whose hands touched every single meal that reached that chamber, whose job existed specifically to guarantee the king's food was safe, and whose position made him, by definition, above the very suspicion that should have fallen on him from the very beginning. He told the king the royal taster's name. The king's expression did not explode into rage, the way Elias had half expected. It did something colder and quieter instead. It settled, like a man finally understanding the shape of a wound he had been carrying for months without being able to see it. He asked Elias why. Why would a man who had served him faithfully for 11 years, who tasted every dish before the king himself ever touched it, who by all appearances had nothing to gain and everything to lose, do such a thing? Elias admitted he did not know the answer to that question. He was a physician, not an investigator. He could tell the king what had been done to his body. He could not tell him why, or by whose. True design though he suspected, and said as much, that a royal taster acting alone, on his own initiative for his own gain, seemed less likely than a royal taster acting as an instrument for someone with far more to gain from a mad king or an empty throne. The king was quiet for a long time after that. Outside the window, the violet dusk had deepened into full night, the lights of the capital spreading out below them like a second dimmer sky. When he finally spoke again, his voice had changed. The tremor was still there, physical, chemical, real. But underneath it, something had hardened. Something that had been buried under months of fear and confusion, and the terrible isolating suspicion that he could no longer trust even his own mind was, for the first time in a long while, standing upright again. He asked Elias what proof would be needed to move against the taster immediately tonight, before the man had any chance to learn that his poison had been discovered. Elias told him the sample from the kitchen, combined with a Threne physician's confirmation of the substance's properties, combined with the taster's own physical examination, which would very likely reveal small, chronic doses of an antidote or resistance-building compound in his own system. Since no one poisons a king slowly for months without protecting themselves from their own poison, would be more than sufficient. The king summoned Cyril. What followed happened with a speed that Elias found almost frightening, given how paralyzed the court had seemed only 2 days earlier. Cyril moved through the palace like a woman who had been waiting a long time for permission to act decisively, gathering the king's personal guard, sealing the kitchens, quietly detaining Bran Otho, the royal taster, under the pretense of a routine health inspection ordered by the visiting human physician. Pretense thin enough that Elias suspected the man understood the moment he was escorted from his quarters exactly what was actually happening. The examination confirmed everything Elias had suspected. Poison. Bran Otho's blood carried unmistakable traces of a resistance compound, taken regularly in careful and controlled doses precisely calibrated to protect him from the very poison passing through his hands and into the king's meals for months. He did not confess immediately, few men in his position would have, but faced with the physical evidence, the resistance compound in his own blood, the matching poison found in the palace's kitchen stores, and the quiet, unblinking presence of the king himself, standing in the doorway of the chamber where he was being questioned, Bran Otho's composure did not survive the night. He gave up a name before dawn. Elias was not present for that particular conversation, and the official record of what exactly was said, and to whom the taster's confession pointed, was sealed by the crown before it ever reached the wider court. But he learned, in the quiet hours before sunrise, standing at the window of his guest chamber and watching the capital's lights begin to fade into the gray light of morning, that the taster had been arrested and removed from the palace before the sun had fully set the previous evening, and that a member of the king's own council, a man who had spoken loudest and most persistently in favor of removing the king from power, on grounds of madness, had been quietly detained shortly after. Elias never learned the full extent of what that council member had been planning, or whether the throne itself had been his ultimate goal, or merely influence over whoever might have replaced the king had the poisoning run its full and intended course. That was a matter for Sane law, Sane politics, Sane justice, and Elias, notably and deliberately, was kept at a careful distance from all of it. He suspected that distance was itself a kind of protection, both for him and for the fragile new order the king was trying to rebuild. What he did learn, in the days that followed, was that the king's tremors, denied their steady chemical fuel, grew worse before they grew better. Elias remained at the palace for another 2 weeks, overseeing the slow and difficult process of purging the poison from the king's system, adjusting his diet, monitoring the withdrawal that came exactly as harshly as the old medical text had warned it would. There were nights when the king raged, when the tremors returned with a violence that frightened even the guards stationed outside his chamber, when Elias sat with him through the worst of it and reminded him, patiently, again and again, that this was the poison leaving his body, not madness taking hold of it, that the man on the other side of this suffering was still, and had always been, entirely himself. There were nights when the king did not believe him. There were nights when Elias was not entirely sure he believed himself. Watching a man twice his height and 3 times his strength shake and weep and rage against a chair someone had thought to bolt to the floor for exactly this purpose. But there were also mornings after those nights. Mornings when the king woke a little steadier than the day before. Mornings when his hands held a cup without trembling for a few more seconds than they had the previous week. Mornings when the fog behind his eyes lifted, just slightly, just enough for Elias to see the shape of the man underneath, patient and shaken and slowly, carefully, coming back into focus. By the end of the 2nd week, the worst of it had passed. The king could sit through a full council session without his hands shaking badly enough to be noticed. He could eat a full meal without the strange, dreadful hunger that had haunted him for months. He slept through the night for the first time, by his own account, in nearly a year. Elias was summoned to the throne room on his final morning at the palace, a formal audience this time, with the full council present, the very body that had summoned him in the first place to determine whether their king had lost his mind. He stood before them, a single unremarkable human physician in a room full of gray-skinned nobility, who had spent months whispering about the fitness of their own ruler. And he delivered his findings exactly as he had first delivered them privately, without softening a single word for the audience now watching him. He told them the king had never been insane. He told them the king had been poisoned slowly and deliberately, by a member of his own household, acting on behalf of forces within the very council now listening to him speak. He told them that the symptoms they had all witnessed and whispered about, and used as justification for questioning their king's fitness to rule, had been manufactured, precisely, by someone who understood exactly what those symptoms would do to the court's confidence. He watched several faces in that room go very still as he spoke. He suspected some of those faces belonged to people who had known exactly what was happening long before he ever arrived, people who had perhaps hoped a human physician, unfamiliar with Sane poisons and Sane politics, would simply certify the king's madness and let the matter end there, quietly, permanently, without ever uncovering the truth beneath it. He did not name anyone in that room directly. That was not his place, and he had been warned quite firmly by both Cyril and the king himself that the matter of the council member's arrest would be handled through Sane channels, not human ones. But he did not need to name anyone. The silence that followed his report, the particular way certain council members refused to meet each other's eyes, said more than any accusation Elias could have made. The king thanked him formally before the full council, in a voice that had regained over 2 weeks nearly all of its former steadiness. He said that Elias Wren, an unremarkable human physician, with no reputation, no faction, and no political weight, had done what 6 far more celebrated physicians before him had failed to do. He had looked at a king everyone assumed was broken, and he had refused to accept the easy answer. He said that Elias had certified, in the end, not the king's sanity alone, but the health of the entire court, by cutting out the rot that had been growing quietly within it. Elias, uncomfortable with the weight of the moment, said only that he had simply done his job. He had examined a patient. He had followed the evidence where it led. He had not set out to uncover a conspiracy or to reshape the balance of power within an alien royal court. He had set out to determine whether a man was sane, and the truth had simply demanded to be followed past that first, narrow question into something much larger. He left Wren a week later on a transport bound back toward human space, carrying with him a modest payment, a formal letter of gratitude sealed with the royal crest, and considerably more gray hair than he had arrived with. He did not become famous. That was, in the end, exactly as he had wanted it. The story of the human physician, who had exposed a slow poisoning at the heart of an alien royal court, remained, for the most part, confined to diplomatic circles and quiet conversations among people who dealt in matters of interstellar politics. Elias returned to his small clinic in the outer colonies, to his unremarkable practice, to the gout of trade ministers and the seasonal fevers of merchants' children, and he did not speak of what had happened on Wren to anyone who did not already know. But something had changed in him, quietly. The way most real changes happen. He found in the years that followed that he no longer flinched away from difficult conclusions simply because they were inconvenient for the people paying him to reach them. He found that he trusted the small, wrong-feeling details more than he trusted the comfortable, obvious explanations that everyone around him seemed eager to accept. A splinter beneath the skin, easy to ignore, impossible to forget, had become something like a professional philosophy. Word did travel, eventually, in the slow and careful way that word travels among people who deal in secrets. Other courts, human and otherwise, began quietly, requesting Elias Wren by name whenever a diagnosis needed to be reached that someone, somewhere, might have preferred to remain unreached. He never advertised this reputation. He never sought it out, but it found him regardless. The way reputations built on genuine competence tend to find the people who earned them, whether or not those people ever wanted the attention in the first place. On Wren, the king, who had once been called mad by his own council, ruled for many more years, steadily, carefully, with a particular attentiveness to the food that reached his table and the loyalty of the people who prepared it. He kept, for the rest of his reign, a small portrait in his private chambers, not of a great general or a beloved ancestor, but of an unremarkable human physician standing awkwardly at the edge of a formal audience, uncomfortable with the praise being heaped upon him, wanting nothing more than to go home. The council member who had orchestrated the poisoning was tried under Certify law in proceedings Elias never witnessed and was never told the full details of. The taster, Bren Otho, faced a similar fate, though the king, in a small and unexpected act of mercy that surprised even Cyril, ensured that the man's family, who had known nothing of what he had done, were left untouched by the scandal that followed. The king's health, monitored carefully by Certify physicians who had studied Elias's methods and his notes long after his departure, never faltered again in quite the same way. The tremors that had once been mistaken for madness became, in the official histories of Wren, a footnote, a brief and dark chapter in an otherwise long and steady reign, remembered mainly as the moment the crown had nearly fallen not to war or rebellion, but to a slow and patient poison administered by someone who had been trusted precisely because no one thought to distrust him. Elias Wren, when asked once, many years later, by a young physician who had heard some garbled version of the story and wanted to know if it was true, gave an answer that was characteristically brief and characteristically dry. He said that everyone had wanted him to answer a simple question: was the king mad or was he not? He said the trouble with simple questions was that they were very rarely the right ones to be asking in the first place. He said the real question had never been about the king's mind at all. It had been about who stood to gain from everyone believing the king had lost it. And of what? He said that once you started asking the right question, the answer usually found itself. You just had to be willing to keep looking past the point where everyone else had already decided they were satisfied. That, he said, was the whole of the job. It had never really been about certifying a man's sanity. It had been about refusing to look away from an inconvenient truth simply because a comfortable lie would have been easier for everyone else to accept. He went back to his tea after that, and did not say much more about it. He never did. But the story remained, quietly passed between physicians who valued their own necks and understood, better than most, the particular danger of being asked to diagnose the person everyone had already decided was the problem. The patient is never the only one in the room who is sick. Elias Wren had proven that on a distant world in a spire-shaped palace beneath a violet sky, and he had done it not with weapons or politics or grand declarations, but with patience, observation, and the simple, stubborn refusal to accept the first easy answer he was handed. Somewhere on Wren, in a portrait hidden in a private chamber, an unremarkable human physician still stood at the edge of history, looking uncomfortable, looking like he wanted nothing more than to go home. He had in the end. And that, perhaps, was the quietest and most fitting ending of all. If you enjoyed this story, let me know what you thought of the physician's quiet unraveling of the court's darkest secret down in the comments below. Stick around for more tales of unlikely competence and quiet justice. And until next time, keep your eyes open for the details everyone else decided weren't worth noticing.